To our amazing viewers at Cheating Tales Lab, we'd love to hear, which part of the world are you joining us from? Let us know. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Life. Marshall Jarvis had always believed in justice. At 42, he was a successful defense attorney with a reputation for taking on the cases others wouldn't touch. His corner office overlooked downtown Chicago, and his name was etched in gold on the building directory. But none of that mattered as much as coming home to his wife of 16 years. Tracy Jarvis was everything Marshall thought he wanted in a partner. At 38, she was still strikingly beautiful, with auburn hair that caught the light just right and eyes that could command a room. More importantly, she was a decorated police detective with the Chicago PD, someone who understood justice the way he did. Or so he thought. Their 15-year-old daughter, Abby Jarvis, had inherited her mother's looks and her father's sharp mind. She was the pride of their lives, excelling in school and already talking about following in her mother's footsteps into law enforcement. Marshall's brother, Zachary Jarvis, often joked that Marshall had won the lottery with Tracy. Zachary, a private investigator who occasionally worked with Marshall's firm, would tease his older brother about having the perfect family. Marshall would smile and agree, never imagining how wrong they both were. The morning of October 15th started like any other. Tracy kissed Marshall goodbye before her shift, promising to pick up Chinese food for dinner. She hugged Abby and reminded her about soccer practice. Everything was normal, routine, perfect. That evening, Marshall's phone rang while he was reviewing case files. The caller ID showed CPD official. Mr. Jarvis? This is Captain Brian Lancaster from the 14th District. I need you to come to Chicago General immediately. There's been an incident involving your wife. The world tilted. Marshall's hands shook as he grabbed his keys, his mind racing through possibilities. Traffic accident. Injured in the line of duty. Nothing prepared him for what Captain Lancaster told him in the hospital corridor. Detective Jarvis was responding to a domestic violence call in Riverside. Lancaster explained, his weathered face grim. The suspect had a gun. Tracy, she took a bullet to the chest. The paramedics did everything they could. Marshall's legs gave out. The sterile hospital floor felt cold against his knees as the reality crashed over him. Tracy was gone. His wife, the mother of his child, his partner in everything, dead at 38. The next few hours blurred together. Abby screams when he told her. Zachary rushing over to handle the arrangements. Phone calls from Tracy's partner, Detective Charlie Craig, offering condolences and promising that justice would be served. The shooter, a man named Javier Hughes, had been arrested at the scene. She died a hero, Captain Lancaster assured him. She saved a woman and her children. That has to count for something. Marshall nodded numbly, but the words felt hollow. Hero or not, Tracy was gone, and he was left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. Chapter 2. The Discovery. 3 days later, Marshall stood in the Cook County morgue, staring at the white sheet that covered his wife's body. The funeral director needed him to confirm some details for the service, and Dr. Jerome Hinton, the coroner, had been kind enough to allow a private viewing. I know this is difficult, Dr. Hinton said softly. Take all the time you need. Marshall approached the table with leaden feet. When the sheet was pulled back, Tracy looked peaceful, almost like she was sleeping. The funeral home had done excellent work covering the wound, but Marshall's trained eye caught the inconsistencies in the makeup around her chest. Doctor, Marshall said, his voice hoarse. Could you show me exactly where she was shot? I need to understand what happened. Dr. Hinton hesitated. Mr. Jarvis, I'm not sure that's. Please. I'm an attorney. I've seen worse. I just need to know. Reluctantly, Dr. Hinton adjusted the sheet and pointed to a small, neat hole just below Tracy's collarbone. The bullet entered here, traveled downward, and lodged near her heart. Death would have been relatively quick. Marshall studied the wound, his legal mind automatically cataloging details. Something felt wrong. The angle seemed odd for someone facing a shooter head-on. Sir, wait, Dr. Hinton said suddenly, frowning as he leaned closer. Look at this. He pointed to the bullet wound more carefully. The bullet is here, but there's something else. Marshall's blood chilled. What do you mean? Dr. Hinton reached for a pair of tweezers from a nearby tray. When we extracted the bullet, we found this lodged behind it. The impact must have driven it deeper into the wound. With careful precision, he probed the wound channel and withdrew something small and metallic. When he held it up to the light, Marshall's world collapsed all over again. It was a gold pendant, a small, intimate piece of jewelry shaped like two interlocking hearts. Marshall had never seen it before, but the inscription on the back made his stomach lurch. "To my beautiful T, forever yours, BL." "BL," Marshall whispered, his mind racing. Then it hit him like a physical blow. Brian Lancaster. Captain Brian Lancaster, who had delivered the news of Tracy's death, who had stood in that hospital corridor offering comfort and condolences. "Mr. Jarvis?" Dr. Hinton's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Are you all right?" Marshall wasn't all right. He would never be all right again. His wife had been wearing another man's pendant when she died. Not just any man, her captain, her superior officer, the man who had looked Marshall in the eye and called her a hero. Could this have been forced into the wound by the bullet's impact? Marshall asked, though he already knew the answer. Dr. Hinton shook his head. Impossible. This was already inside her clothing, pressed against her skin. The bullet drove it into the wound channel, but she was wearing it when she was shot. Marshall pocketed the pendant without thinking. His mind was operating on pure autopilot now, processing information the way it did during the most complex cases. But this wasn't a case. This was his life falling apart in real time. "Dr. Hinton," Marshall said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I need you to do me a favor. Don't mention this pendant to anyone. Not in your report, not to the police, not to anyone. Can you do that?" The coroner looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Jarvis, I'm not sure I should. My daughter just lost her mother. If word gets out that Tracy was involved with someone, it will destroy what little piece Abby has left. Please." After a long moment, Dr. Hinton nodded. "The pendant was never here." "But Marshall, what are you going to do?" Marshall looked down at his wife's peaceful face one last time. "I'm going to find out the truth. All of it." Chapter 3. Unraveling the Truth. Marshall's law office felt different when he returned the next morning. Everything looked the same. The mahogany desk, the wall of law books, the framed photos of Tracy and Abby, but nothing would ever be the same again. He sat in his leather chair and stared at the pendant, which seemed to mock him from where it lay on his desk. His secretary, Letitia Slater, had been with the firm for 8 years and knew him well enough to recognize when something was wrong. "Mr. Jarvis, the funeral arrangements are all set for tomorrow. Is there anything else you need?" "Letitia, I need you to pull everything we have on Captain Brian Lancaster, Chicago PD. Traffic records, property records, financial records, everything that's publicly available." She looked surprised, but didn't question the request. Marshall had built his reputation on being thorough, and she was used to unusual research requests. While she worked, Marshall called his brother. "Zachary, I need you to run a background check." Quietly. "On who?" "Brian Lancaster, CPD Captain, 14th District." There was a pause. "Marshall, that's the guy who—" "I know who he is. Can you do it or not?" "Of course, but what's this about?" Marshall fingered the pendant. "I'll explain later. Just find out everything you can about his personal life. Who he sees, where he goes, who he's been spending time with." After hanging up, Marshall sat back and tried to think clearly. The pendant proved Tracy was having an affair with Lancaster, but it didn't explain the circumstances of her death. According to the official report, she had responded to a domestic violence call and been shot by the perpetrator, Javier Hughes. Lancaster hadn't even been on the scene. By afternoon, both Letitia and Zachary had returned with information that painted a disturbing picture. Lancaster was married with 2 teenage children, but his financial records showed regular payments to a downtown apartment that wasn't his residence. Cell phone records, obtained through Zachary's contacts in the telecommunications industry, showed frequent calls between Lancaster and Tracy's personal phone, often during hours when Tracy had told Marshall she was working late. The most damning evidence came from traffic cameras. Zachary had pulled footage from the week before Tracy's death, and it showed Tracy's car parked outside Lancaster's apartment building on 3 separate occasions. "How long do you think this was going on?" Zachary asked when he delivered the files. Marshall studied the timeline. "At least 6 months, maybe longer. She started working more overtime about 8 months ago. Said the department was understaffed." "What are you going to do?" That was the question Marshall had been avoiding. The smart thing would be to confront Lancaster privately, maybe threaten to expose the affair unless he transferred out of the district. The legal thing would be to report it to Internal Affairs and let the department handle it. But Marshall Was Jarvis wasn't feeling smart or legal. He was feeling betrayed, humiliated, and angry in a way that made his hands shake. "I'm going to destroy him," Marshall said quietly. "Both of them." "Both?" "Marshall, Tracy's dead. Her reputation isn't. And neither is her memory with Abby." Marshall looked at his brother with cold determination. "By the time I'm done, no one will remember Tracy Jarvis as a hero. They'll remember her as a lying, cheating cop who died with her lover's pendant around her neck." Zachary looked uncomfortable. "That seems harsh." "You know what's harsh? 15 years of marriage being a lie. Abby thinking her mother was perfect when she was anything but. Lancaster standing in that hospital and calling her a hero while he knew damn well what kind of woman she really was." Marshall stood and walked to his window, looking out at the city he'd spent his career protecting through the law. Now the law felt insufficient for what he needed to do. "There's something else," Zachary said reluctantly. "I looked into the shooting itself. Javier Hughes, the guy who killed Tracy, he's got no prior history of domestic violence. His girlfriend says the whole thing was out of character. She's claiming he was set up." Marshall turned back to his brother. "Set up how?" "She says someone called Hughes and told him she was cheating on him with another guy. Gave him an address and said he'd find them together. Hughes went there with a gun, but instead of finding his girlfriend with another man, he found Tracy Jarvis." The implications hit Marshall like a sledgehammer. Someone used Hughes as a weapon. That's what it looks like. The question is who? Marshall thought about Lancaster's demeanor at the hospital. The man had been calm, almost resigned. Not like someone who had just lost a lover, but like someone who had been expecting bad news. "Find out who made that call to Hughes," Marshall said. "And find out where Lancaster was when Tracy was shot." "Marshall, if Lancaster orchestrated Tracy's murder, then he used my wife and killed her when she became inconvenient. And if that's true, destroying his reputation won't be nearly enough." Marshall's phone buzzed with a text from Abby, asking when he'd be home. He looked at the message and felt something hard and cold settle in his chest. His daughter was grieving a mother who didn't deserve her tears. His marriage had been a sham. His life had been built on lies. But Marshall Jarvis was a man who understood justice. And sometimes justice required methods the courts couldn't provide. Chapter 4. The Painful Truth. The funeral was a masterpiece of deception. Hundreds of police officers in dress blues lined the street outside St. Michael's Cathedral. Captain Lancaster delivered a eulogy that painted Tracy as a devoted wife, mother, and officer who had died protecting others. The mayor attended. The police superintendent spoke about Tracy's exemplary service record. Marshall sat in the front pew with Abby, who sobbed quietly against his shoulder, and watched it all with growing revulsion. Every word of praise felt like a knife twist. Every flower, every honor guard salute, every mention of Tracy's heroism was built on a lie. Lancaster approached them after the service. "Marshall, if there's anything you need, anything at all, you just call me. She was special. We all loved her." Marshall shook the man's hand and looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of guilt or grief. All he saw was a calculated performance. "Thank you, Brian. I know how much she meant to the department." That evening, after the last visitor had left and Abby had cried herself to sleep, Marshall sat in his study with a glass of whiskey and a growing file of evidence. Zachary had been busy. The phone call to Javier Hughes had come from a burner phone purchased with cash 3 days before the shooting. The store's security camera showed a man in a baseball cap and sunglasses making the purchase, but the build and gait matched Lancaster's profile. More damning was Lancaster's whereabouts during the shooting. He'd told investigators he was at home with his family, but traffic cameras showed his car leaving his house 20 minutes before Tracy was shot and returning an hour after her death was confirmed. The picture was becoming clear, and it was uglier than Marshall had imagined. Lancaster hadn't just been having an affair with Tracy. He'd orchestrated her murder when she became a liability. Marshall's phone rang. It was Zachary. "I found something else," his brother said without preamble. "Tracy had life insurance through the department. $1 million policy. So, the beneficiary was recently changed. Instead of just you and Abby, it now includes a trust fund she set up 3 months ago. Guess who the trustee is?" Marshall's blood turned to ice. "Lancaster." Bingo. She was funneling money to him, and when she died, he'd have access to 1/3 of the insurance payout through that trust. Marshall set down his whiskey with a steady hand. "She was going to leave me. Looks like it. There are apartment applications in her name, divorce papers that were never filed, even school transfer requests for Abby. The betrayal was complete. Tracy hadn't just been having an affair, she'd been planning to destroy their family and take their daughter. Lancaster had been manipulating her, using her, and when things got complicated, he'd eliminated her and framed an innocent man. There's one more thing, Zachary said. Hughes's girlfriend? She's been getting death threats since she started talking about the setup. Someone wants her to stay quiet. Marshall closed his eyes. An innocent man was sitting in jail for murder, his girlfriend was being terrorized into silence, and the real killer was walking free, collecting condolences and planning to cash in on his victim's insurance policy. Zachary, I need you to do something for me. Name it. Find out everything you can about Lancaster's family. His wife, his kids, their routines, their weaknesses. And I need you to locate Hughes's girlfriend. I want to talk to her. Marshall, what are you planning? Marshall opened his eyes and stared at the framed photo of Tracy and Abby on his desk. In it, Tracy was smiling, her arm around their daughter, looking every inch the loving mother and devoted wife. It was all a lie. I'm going to give Lancaster exactly what he gave Tracy. A setup so perfect that by the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it. And if you get caught, I won't. Because unlike Lancaster, I'm not going to be sloppy. And unlike Tracy, I'm not going to underestimate the people I'm betraying. Marshall hung up and walked to his safe. Inside, along with important documents and some cash, was his father's service revolver from World War II. Marshall had never fired it, but he'd kept it maintained and loaded as a family heirloom. He held the gun in his hands and thought about justice. The courts would give Lancaster a trial, maybe a conviction if they could prove the case. But even if he was found guilty, he'd spend his life in prison while Tracy's reputation remained intact, and Abby continued to mourn a mother who didn't deserve her grief. That wasn't justice. That was just law. And sometimes, Marshall was beginning to understand, justice required a more personal touch. He locked the gun away and returned to his desk. Tomorrow he would start planning. Lancaster had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that Marshall was just another grieving widower who would accept the official story and move on. He'd never been more wrong about anything in his life. Chapter 5. Gathering Allies. Marshall's first move was to reach out to Javier Hughes's girlfriend, Lena Meyer. She was living in a safe house run by a women's shelter, having fled her apartment after the third death threat. When Marshall finally located her through his contacts in the legal aid community, she was suspicious and terrified. I already told the police everything, she said when Marshall visited her at the shelter. Nobody believes me. Lena was 26, with tired eyes and nervous hands that never stopped moving. She worked as a waitress at a diner on the south side and had been dating Hughes for 2 years. According to her, he was gentle, never violent, and completely devastated by what he'd done. Javier keeps saying someone tricked him, she told Marshall. He got a call saying I was cheating on him, that I'd be at this address with another man. He was so hurt, so angry. He just wanted to confront me, not kill anyone. Marshall leaned forward. Lena, I believe you. And I think I know who set Javier up. Her eyes widened. You do? The police officer who was killed. She was having an affair with her captain. I think he wanted her dead and used Javier to do it. Lena stared at him. You're her husband. Yes. And I want to help you prove Javier was manipulated. It took 2 hours of careful conversation, but eventually Lena agreed to cooperate. She had saved voicemails from the death threats, and Marshall's trained ear detected something in the caller's voice, a slight accent, a particular cadence, that reminded him of Lancaster. His next stop was the Chicago PD's Internal Affairs Division. Marshall had done legal work for several IA investigators over the years, and he called in a favor with Detective Arthur Lowe. I need you to look into something off the books, Marshall told Lowe over coffee at a downtown diner. Captain Lancaster and Detective Tracy Jarvis. Lowe raised an eyebrow. Your wife? Marshall, I heard about the shooting. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you. But I have reason to believe Lancaster was involved with Tracy inappropriately. Marshall showed Lowe copies of the financial records and phone logs, careful not to mention the pendant or his suspicions about the murder. IA investigators were good at following paper trails, but they were also bound by regulations and oversight. This is concerning, Lowe admitted after reviewing the evidence. If Lancaster was having an affair with a subordinate, That's a serious violation of department policy. I want him investigated. Quietly. Marshal, you know I can't promise anything. If we find evidence of wrongdoing, we have to follow protocol. I understand. Just look into it. Please. Lowe agreed, and Marshall left feeling like he'd lit the first fuse. Internal Affairs would start sniffing around Lancaster, making him nervous, forcing him to make mistakes. That afternoon, Marshall met with his most trusted private investigator, a woman named Angelica Parsons who specialized in surveillance and electronic monitoring. Angelica had helped him on several high-profile cases and was known for her discretion and technical expertise. I need you to watch someone, Marshall told her. Captain Brian Lancaster, Chicago PD. I want to know where he goes, who he talks to, what he does when he thinks nobody's looking. Angelica was in her 40s, with sharp features and an all-business demeanor. This is about your wife, isn't it? Yes. What am I looking for specifically? Marshall hesitated. How much should he tell her? Too little, and she might miss something important. Too much, and she might decide the job was too risky. I think Lancaster was involved with Tracy, and that he may have had something to do with her death. Angelica's expression didn't change. She'd heard worse. You want electronic surveillance too? Phone taps, computer monitoring. Whatever you can do legally. And if legal methods don't get us what we need? Marshall met her eyes. Then we'll discuss other options. She nodded and named her fee. Marshall agreed without negotiating. Money was the least of his concerns now. That evening, Marshall sat down with Abby for the first time since the funeral to really talk. His daughter was struggling, alternating between grief and anger, barely eating, not sleeping well. She'd inherited Tracy's beauty but also Marshall's intelligence, and she was asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. Dad, why did Mom have to respond to that call? Wasn't there another officer who could have gone? Marshall chose his words carefully. Sometimes officers have to respond to emergencies even when they're not officially on duty. Your mother was brave. But the man who shot her, why did he have a gun? Why was he so angry? These were the questions that would have innocent answers if the official story was true. But knowing what Marshall knew now, they felt like knives. Some people make bad choices when they're angry, honey. That's why your mother's job was so important. She helped protect people from those bad choices. Abby nodded, but Marshall could see she wasn't entirely satisfied. She was too smart, too perceptive. Eventually, she would start connecting dots, asking harder questions, demanding answers he couldn't give without destroying her faith in everything she thought she knew about her mother. Unless he acted first. That night, Marshall stood in his study and looked at the evidence spread across his desk. Financial records, surveillance photos, phone logs, witness statements. It painted a clear picture of betrayal and murder, but it wasn't enough for a court of law. It was, however, enough for a different kind of justice. Marshall opened his laptop and began typing. If Lancaster wanted to play games with people's lives, Marshall would show him how a real strategist operated. The captain had made the mistake of thinking Marshall was just another victim to be manipulated. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Chapter 6. The Setup. 3 weeks after Tracy's funeral, Marshall's plan began to take shape. Angelica's surveillance had revealed Lancaster's patterns. He visited the downtown apartment twice a week, always on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. He told his wife he was working late, but the apartment was where he'd been meeting Tracy and where he was now apparently meeting someone new. Who's the new woman? Marshall asked Angelica during their weekly briefing. Joyce Burton, 29, works as a police dispatcher. Single, no kids, lives alone. Angelica showed him surveillance photos of a blonde woman entering and leaving Lancaster's apartment. She started showing up about a week after your wife's funeral. Marshall studied the photos. Lancaster wasn't grieving Tracy's death. He was already replacing her. The cold calculation of it made Marshall's resolve even stronger. Arthur Lowe's internal affairs investigation was proceeding slowly but steadily. Lancaster was being questioned about his relationship with Tracy, and according to Lowe, the captain was getting nervous. He's lawyered up, Lowe told Marshall over lunch. That usually means he knows he's in trouble. What have you found? Enough to confirm the affair. We can prove they were involved, but proving any wrongdoing related to her death is going to be harder. Lancaster's alibi for the night of the shooting is thin, but it's not non-existent. Marshall nodded. He'd expected as much. Lancaster was too smart to leave obvious evidence of murder. But he wasn't smart enough to anticipate what Marshall was planning. The key to Marshall's plan was Javier Hughes. The man was sitting in Cook County Jail, awaiting trial for Tracy's murder, slowly going insane with guilt and confusion. His public defender was overworked and underpaid, treating the case as a simple murder with an obvious perpetrator. Marshall arranged to visit Hughes through his connections in the legal community. The man was broken, barely eating, aged years in the few weeks since the shooting. "I didn't mean to kill anyone," Hughes told Marshall through the jail's plexiglass barrier. "I just thought. Someone told me Lena was cheating. I wanted to catch them together, make them explain. I never meant to hurt that lady." Marshall leaned forward. "Javier, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully. The voice that called you, did you recognize it at all?" Hughes shook his head. It was muffled, like someone was trying to disguise it. But it was definitely a man. Older, maybe. He knew things about Lena, about our relationship. I thought maybe it was someone from her work. "What kinds of things?" "He knew we'd been fighting about her working late shifts. He knew I was worried she was pulling away from me. It's like he'd been watching us." Marshall filed that information away. Lancaster would have had access to police databases, surveillance capabilities, ways to gather intelligence on potential pawns like Hughes. "Javier, if I could prove that someone tricked you into going to that address, would you be willing to testify about it?" Hope flickered in Hughes's eyes. "You think someone set me up?" "I think someone used you as a weapon, and I think I can prove it." Marshall's next move was the most delicate. He needed to get Lancaster to reveal himself, to make a mistake that would expose his guilt. And he knew exactly how to do it. Through Angelica, Marshall learned that Lancaster's wife, Caroline O'Brien Lancaster, was having problems of her own. Their marriage was strained, their finances were tight despite Lancaster's captain's salary, and their teenage children were acting out. Caroline worked as a school administrator and was active in community groups, a classic police wife trying to maintain normalcy while her husband's career consumed their family life. Marshall decided to approach her indirectly. He arranged to accidentally encounter her at a coffee shop near her office, striking up a conversation about the challenges of raising teenagers. Caroline was lonely, stressed, and eager to talk to someone who seemed to understand her struggles. "Brian's been so distant lately," she confided during their third chance meeting. "Ever since that officer was killed, Detective Jarvis, he's been working even more hours, drinking more, coming home angry." Marshall expressed sympathy while carefully probing. "That must be hard on the whole family when something like that happens." "It is. And Brian was so close to her, professionally I mean. He keeps saying he should have done more to protect her." "Close professionally?" Caroline's expression darkened. "Maybe too close. There were rumors, you know, about him and some of the female officers. I tried not to listen, but—" Marshall's pulse quickened. "That must be difficult to deal with. I found receipts for expensive dinners at restaurants we never went to. Hotel charges on his credit card. When I asked about them, he said they were work expenses, but—" She trailed off, looking embarrassed for sharing so much with a relative stranger. Marshall offered gentle support and understanding, positioning himself as a safe confidant. Over the next week, he carefully cultivated Caroline's trust while planting seeds of doubt about her husband's fidelity and honesty. The breakthrough came when Caroline mentioned that Brian had been receiving phone calls at all hours since Tracy's death. "He says it's work, but he takes the calls in the garage, like he doesn't want me to hear." That night, Marshall called Angelica. "I need you to monitor Lancaster's phone. All of it. Work phone, personal phone, any burner phones he might be using. That's going to require some creative interpretation of legal boundaries. Do whatever you have to do." Angelica's electronic surveillance revealed that Lancaster was indeed using a burner phone to communicate with someone whose number traced back to a criminal defense attorney named Stuart Wright. Wright had a reputation for representing dirty cops and organized crime figures. Exactly the kind of lawyer someone would call if they were trying to cover up a murder. Marshall researched Wright's client list and found several names that made his blood run cold. The lawyer had represented police officers involved in evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and even one case of suspected contract killing that never went to trial. The pieces were falling into place. Lancaster had killed Tracy, framed Hughes, and was now working with a criminal lawyer to ensure his crime stayed hidden. But he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated Marshall's ability to strike back. Marshall's plan was elegant in its simplicity. He would force Lancaster to reveal his guilt by threatening the one thing the man valued more than his freedom, his reputation and his family's security. And he would do it in a way that ensured Lancaster would never be able to hurt anyone else again. The trap was set. Now all Marshall had to do was spring it. Chapter 7. Closing the net. The first crack in Lancaster's composure came when Internal Affairs officially opened their investigation. Arthur Lowe called Marshall to report that Lancaster had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the inquiry into his relationship with Tracy. "He's scared," Lowe said. "Scared people make mistakes." Lancaster's first mistake was calling Stuart Wright from his personal phone instead of the burner. Angelica's surveillance picked up the conversation, and what she heard made Marshall's blood boil. "The IA thing is heating up," Lancaster said on the recording. "They're asking about Tracy, about the money. Did you clean out the apartment?" Wright's voice was gravelly, professional. "Yeah, but there might be other evidence. Photos, maybe videos. She was always taking pictures." "What kind of photos?" "The kind that could end my marriage and my career." Marshall listened to the recording 3 times, memorizing every word. Lancaster and Wright were worried about evidence that could expose the affair, but they weren't discussing the murder directly. They were being careful, speaking in code. But Marshall didn't need them to confess on tape. He needed them to panic. His next move was to have Angelica plant evidence that someone was getting close to the truth about Tracy's murder. She hacked into Stuart Wright's email system and left a draft message in his deleted folder that appeared to be from an anonymous tipster offering to sell information about what really happened to Detective Jarvis. The email was vague enough to be believable, but specific enough to terrify Lancaster if he saw it. It mentioned the burner phone used to call Hughes and hinted at the existence of a witness who saw Lancaster near the murder scene. Within hours, Wright was calling Lancaster in a panic. "We have a problem," Wright said on the monitored call. "Someone knows about the Hughes setup." "That's impossible. There's no evidence." "There's always evidence if you know where to look. This anonymous source claims to have proof you were near the scene when the shooting happened." Lancaster's breathing became audible on the recording. "What do they want?" "Money. A lot of it. But Brian, if this gets out..." "It won't. I'll handle it." The conversation ended abruptly, but Marshall had heard enough. Lancaster was going to try to eliminate the anonymous witness, a witness who didn't actually exist. Marshall's next step was to arrange a meeting between Lancaster and the fictional witness. Using an encrypted email account, he reached out to Wright's office claiming to be the anonymous tipster and demanding a face-to-face meeting to negotiate the sale of evidence. The meeting was set for the following evening at a warehouse in an industrial district on the south side. Marshall chose the location carefully, isolated enough for privacy, but covered by enough security cameras to document everything that happened. On the night of the meeting, Marshall positioned himself with a perfect view of the warehouse entrance. He brought his father's service revolver and a digital camera with a telephoto lens. Angelica was stationed across the street with her own surveillance equipment. Lancaster arrived 20 minutes early, which confirmed his nervous state. He was carrying a briefcase, presumably filled with money for the buy-off, and constantly checking his surroundings. At exactly 9 p.m., a figure approached the warehouse. Marshall smiled grimly as he recognized the man, Ricardo Singleton, a professional enforcer with connections to Wright's criminal clients. Lancaster wasn't planning to buy silence. He was planning to ensure it permanently. Marshall waited until Singleton entered the warehouse, then called Lancaster's cell phone. "Captain Lancaster? Who is this?" "Someone who knows what you did to Tracy Jarvis." "And to Javier Hughes." Lancaster's voice went cold. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you do. I know about the burner phone. I know you were near the scene when Tracy was shot. I know you set up Hughes to take the fall. You have no proof." "Actually, I do. I have photos of you making the purchase of the burner phone. I have traffic camera footage of your car leaving your house the night Tracy died. Most importantly, I have this." Marshall described the pendant without mentioning how he'd obtained it. Lancaster's sharp intake of breath told him everything he needed to know. "Where did you get that?" "Does it matter? The point is, I have evidence that proves Tracy was your lover and that you orchestrated her murder. The question is what you're willing to do to keep that evidence from becoming public. What do you want?" Marshall smiled. "I want you to come outside. Alone. Leave your friend in the warehouse." "What friend?" "Ricardo Singleton. The enforcer you brought to kill me. Did you really think I was stupid enough to walk into your trap?" The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds. Then Lancaster spoke, his voice barely controlled. "Who are you?" "I'm Justice, Captain. Something you've forgotten about. Come outside. Now, or I start making phone calls to reporters." Marshall watched through his telephoto lens as Lancaster emerged from the warehouse, looking frantically around for the source of the voice on the phone. "I'm here," Lancaster said. "What now?" "Now you're going to confess. You're going to tell me exactly what you did to Tracy and why." "I'm not confessing to anything." "Then I guess your wife will be very interested to learn about your affair. And Internal Affairs will be fascinated by the evidence I'm about to turn over. And the FBI will want to investigate your connection to Ricardo Singleton and Stuart Wright." Marshall could see Lancaster's hands shaking as he held the phone. The man was breaking down, caught between the impossible choice of confessing to murder or watching his entire life collapse. "You don't understand," Lancaster said finally. "Tracy was going to ruin everything. She was going to leave her husband, take their kid, demand that I leave my wife. She was talking about going public with our relationship if I didn't. She would have destroyed both our families. So you killed her." "I didn't have a choice. She was out of control, making threats, talking about exposing department corruption. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen." Marshall's finger tightened on the camera's shutter release, capturing every word, every expression of guilt. "Tell me about Hughes." "Hughes was convenient. His girlfriend worked at the same diner where Tracy and I sometimes met. He was jealous, paranoid, easy to manipulate. I just gave him a little push in the right direction by telling him his girlfriend was cheating and giving him Tracy's location. It was supposed to look random. A disturbed man kills a police officer during a domestic dispute. No one would look too closely." Marshall had heard enough. The confession was complete, recorded, and documented. Lancaster had just admitted to first-degree murder and conspiracy. But Marshall wasn't finished with him yet. Chapter 8, Justice Served. "Captain Lancaster," Marshall said into the phone, still hidden in his surveillance position. "Do you know who you're talking to?" "No. My name is Marshall Jarvis. Tracy was my wife." The effect was immediate and devastating. Lancaster staggered backward as if he'd been physically struck, his face going pale in the warehouse's security lighting. That's impossible. You don't know." "I know everything. I know about the apartment you rented for your affairs. I know about the life insurance money you were planning to steal. I know you manipulated my wife into betraying her family. And when she became inconvenient, you had her murdered." Lancaster dropped his briefcase, his hands shaking visibly. "Marshall, listen to me. You don't understand what Tracy was like. She was..." "Careful." Marshall's voice cut through the night air like ice. "You're talking about the mother of my child. The woman I loved for 16 years before you corrupted her. She wasn't innocent. She came to me. She pursued the relationship. She was unhappy with her marriage, with her life. I didn't force her into anything." Marshall felt rage building in his chest, but he kept his voice level. "Maybe, but you did force her into a grave." Lancaster looked around desperately, as if searching for an escape route. "What do you want from me? I want you to understand something. You didn't just kill my wife, you stole my daughter's mother. You made my child grieve for a woman who was planning to abandon her. You destroyed an innocent man's life by framing him for murder. You're not just a killer, Lancaster. You're a disease. I can make this right. I can testify that Hughes was set up, get the charges dropped. I can confess to the affair, take responsibility for my mistakes." Marshall almost laughed. "Your mistakes? You think this was a mistake? Please, Marshall. I have children too. A family. If this comes out, your family will learn what kind of man you really are. Just like mine did." Marshall stepped out from his hiding place, finally revealing himself. He kept the gun concealed but ready, his camera capturing everything as Lancaster saw him for the first time. "You've been recording this," Lancaster said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Every word. And it's already been uploaded to secure servers with instructions for release if anything happens to me. Did you really think I'd confront you without insurance?" Lancaster's face cycled through emotions: fear, anger, desperation, calculation. Marshall could see the man trying to figure out his options, and the realization that he had none. "What happens now?" Lancaster asked. "Now you face a choice. You can take the easy way out, write a full confession, turn yourself in, and maybe spare your family the worst of the publicity. Or you can fight it, and I'll destroy you piece by piece in public, starting with releasing the recording of this conversation to every news outlet in Chicago. And if I confess, Javier Hughes goes free. Your family learns the truth quietly instead of reading about it in the newspapers. And you serve your time knowing you at least did one decent thing at the end. Lancaster stared at Marshall for a long moment. You planned this whole thing. The anonymous witness, the meeting, all of it. I learned from watching you operate. The difference is, my target actually deserved what he got. A sound from the warehouse reminded them both that Ricardo Singleton was still inside, presumably waiting for orders that would never come. What about him? Lancaster nodded toward the building. He's going to be very disappointed. But that's your problem, not mine. Marshall pulled out his phone and showed Lancaster the screen. I'm calling 911 in exactly 60 seconds. You can be here when they arrive, or you can disappear and spend the rest of your life running. But either way, the evidence goes public tomorrow morning. Lancaster closed his eyes, the weight of his choices finally crushing down on him. When he opened them again, Marshall saw a broken man who understood that his life as he'd known it was over. My kids, Lancaster whispered. They're going to hate me. They should. Just like my daughter would hate her mother if she knew the truth. Are you going to tell her? Marshall considered the question. Abby was young, resilient, still capable of healing from loss without the additional burden of betrayal. No, some lies are kinder than the truth, but only when the people responsible for the lies are dead or imprisoned. Lancaster nodded slowly. I'll confess, but I want immunity for my wife. She didn't know anything about this. Your wife isn't my concern. My only interest is making sure you never hurt anyone else again. Marshall's phone showed 30 seconds. Decide now, Lancaster. Easy way or hard way? Easy way, Lancaster said, his voice barely audible. Marshall dialed 911. This is Marshall Jarvis. I'm at Warehouse 47 on Industrial Boulevard. I have Captain Brian Lancaster of the Chicago PD here, and he wants to confess to the murder of Detective Tracy Jarvis. As sirens began to wail in the distance, Lancaster looked at Marshall one last time. Does it make you feel better? Getting your revenge. Marshall thought about Tracy's lies, about Abby's tears, about Javier Hughes sitting in a jail cell for a crime he'd been manipulated into committing. Ask me after you're sentenced, he said. Chapter 9, New Beginnings. 6 months later, Marshall sat in his office reading the final reports on what the media had dubbed the Lancaster conspiracy. The former police captain had been sentenced to life in prison without parole for the first-degree murder of Tracy Jarvis. Stuart Wright was facing federal charges for conspiracy and evidence tampering. Ricardo Singleton had been arrested and was cooperating with authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. Javier Hughes was free, his conviction overturned based on the evidence of Lancaster's manipulation. Lena Meyer had moved to another state with financial assistance from a victims fund Marshall had quietly established. Both of them were trying to rebuild their lives after becoming unwitting pawns in Lancaster's game. The investigation had revealed the full scope of Lancaster's corruption, 3 other affairs with subordinates, evidence tampering in at least a dozen cases, and connections to organized crime figures through Wright's network. Internal Affairs had cleaned house, with 4 other officers facing charges related to Lancaster's activities. Abby knocked on Marshall's office door, interrupting his reading. At 16, she'd grown taller, more confident, but still carried shadows of the trauma from losing her mother. Dad, you ready to go? Marshall smiled and closed the file. Today was the day they were moving out of the house where Tracy had lived and lied for so many years. They'd found a new place across town, smaller but brighter, with no memories of betrayal embedded in the walls. Just finishing up some paperwork. How are you feeling about the move? Abby shrugged. Good, I think. It'll be weird not living in Mom's house anymore, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Over the past 6 months, Marshall had been careful to let Abby process her grief naturally, while gradually helping her understand that her mother had been complicated, flawed, human. He'd never told her about the affair or the circumstances of Tracy's death, but he'd helped her see that hero worship wasn't healthy and that people could be good and bad at the same time. Dad, can I ask you something? Always. Were you and Mom happy? Really happy? Sometimes I remember fights, times when things felt tense. I used to think I was imagining it. Marshall chose his words carefully. Your mother and I loved each other, but our marriage wasn't perfect. No marriages. People change, grow apart sometimes. But that doesn't mean the good times weren't real. Abby nodded thoughtfully. I've been thinking about what I want to do after high school. I don't think I want to be a police officer anymore. What do you want to do? Maybe law school. Like you. But I want to help people who've been hurt by the system, people who need someone to fight for them when nobody else will. Marshall felt a surge of pride. His daughter was choosing justice over vengeance, advocacy over enforcement. She was going to be stronger than either of her parents. I think that's a wonderful idea, and I'll help you however I can. They drove to the new house together, listening to music and talking about Abby's senior year plans. As they pulled into the driveway, Marshall's phone rang. It was Arthur Lowe from Internal Affairs. Marshall, I wanted to let you know, Lancaster tried to hang himself in his cell last night. Marshall felt no satisfaction, no joy, just a tired recognition that some people preferred death to facing the consequences of their choices. Is he alive? Yeah, he's on suicide watch now. But I thought you should know. Thanks for calling. Abby looked at him curiously. Everything okay? Just work stuff. Nothing important. That evening, as they unpacked boxes in their new home, Marshall found himself thinking about justice and revenge, about the difference between the two and whether it mattered in the end. Lancaster was in prison, Hughes was free, and the truth had been revealed. But Tracy was still dead, and Marshall was still a widower raising a teenage daughter alone. The revenge had been satisfying in the moment, but it hadn't brought Tracy back or erased the betrayal. What it had done was restore balance, ensuring that the guilty were punished and the innocent were protected. Zachary stopped by to help with the move, bringing pizza and beer for the adults, soda for Abby. So, he said when Abby was out of earshot, any regrets about how everything went down? Marshall considered the question while unpacking books for his new study. No regrets about Lancaster. He got exactly what he deserved. What about Tracy? Marshall paused, holding a framed photo of Tracy and Abby from better times. I regret that I never really knew the woman I was married to. I regret that Abby lost her mother so young. I regret that Lancaster corrupted someone I loved. But not that she's dead. It was a brutal question, but Zachary had earned the right to ask it after everything he'd done to help Marshall uncover the truth. No, Marshall said finally. Not that she's dead. She made her choices, and they led to consequences. I just made sure the right person paid for those consequences. Abby called from the kitchen, asking for help with something, and Marshall put the photo away. The past was finished, settled, done. What mattered now was building a future for himself and his daughter. A future based on truth instead of lies, strength instead of betrayal. As he walked toward the kitchen to help Abby, Marshall felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not happiness. That would come later, if it came at all, but the deep satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served and that he'd protected the people who mattered most. The old Marshall Jarvis had believed in the law, in courts and procedures, and official justice. The new Marshall understood that sometimes justice required a more personal touch. He'd learned to be both lawyer and judge, investigator and executioner. And if another predator ever threatened his family, Marshall was ready to teach that lesson again. Outside, snow began to fall on their new neighborhood, covering everything in clean, white silence. Marshall smiled and went to help his daughter build their new life together. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.